Welcome to Litigation Psychology Podcast, brought to you by Courtroom Sciences, Inc. I am Dr. Steve Wood. And, in my career, I talk to a lot of different attorneys, and I get to hear a lot of cool stories from them about their experiences and what led them into the legal field. And every once in a while, you hear a story where you say, man, that's awesome. That's a really cool background. And it just so happens that I invited on one of those said attorneys who has a very cool background, Justin Ratley from Munsch Hardt in Houston. Justin, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today, man?
Good to see you. It's been a while since I've seen you. We worked together a little while ago, but great to see your face. Great to have you on the podcast. So thanks for coming on.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invite.
And, just to give the listeners a background, as I teed you up, can you let them know what is it that you have as your background that led you into being an attorney? What did you do prior to and in your previous life, as we would say?
Yeah, happy to talk about it. So before I went to law school, I spent about a decade in military intelligence and federal law enforcement. And so I've done tactical intelligence collections overseas and in Afghanistan, and then I did federal law enforcement, and I've worked everywhere actually in law enforcement, from Afghanistan and Hawaii, Colorado, and DC.
Very cool. And I know that we've talked before that the skills and the experiences that you had in those have transferred over to an attorney, but at the same time, I know that you bring to the table some different experiences based upon your background that help you. So can you talk a little bit about that, like what it is that you have been able to bring over and how you've seen it to help you when it comes to interviewing witnesses or getting ready for depositions or trial or anything of that nature?
Yeah, no, I'm glad. So I think kind of from the very high level issues, right? I mean, you learn a different type of analysis doing intelligence stuff and working in law enforcement. You learn how to kind of quickly sift through large amounts of data and actually, make it useful. And so I think that was very helpful. But kind of more in the lane you and I've worked together with, on depositions, there's a lot of similarities between depositions and what we do in interview and interrogation, both in both of my backgrounds. I probably won't spend much time talking about the intel side, but the law enforcement side, there's a lot of similarities.
Okay. And, I guess, do you ever find yourself slipping into law enforcement mode when you're given these depositions, or how do you make that demarcation and separation from, okay, I'm an attorney now versus being a law enforcement? I think it really just kind of, I get into that mode where there's not like the law enforcement mode. It's just that interviewing mode when I get into deposition. So I think sometimes I tend to not do depositions like a normal attorney. And I'll ask a lot of questions that would be faux pas in the normal world, but it's because I've already gotten the rapport established and the cadence and the tempo. And so I can ask an open-ended question knowing what the answers are going to be, and I don't have to zero it in as a leading question. And I think that's a good point. And like I said, when we worked together, I did notice that was one of the things that when you worked with witnesses, it was a lot easier to have that rapport because you had it naturally, whereas sometimes it comes forced to some others to try to develop the rapport. And it just seems, it seems like witnesses might be on guard because they're not sure whether or not you're just trying to chat them up, what your angle is. But you have a very kind of fluid ability to build rapport with witnesses, which I think helps you probably in your day-to-day activities.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, a lot of the things that kind of link up between, your law enforcement interviews and how you do it for depositions, I think things that people don't think about is kind of the timing and the tempo. One of the things that you can control a lot more in an interview and an interrogation is your spacing to the person. You lose that in a deposition. There's, a big, massive table between you, but you learn a lot, through about 1,000 interviews and interrogations, how to put pressure without without being demanding. You provide pressure by closing the space, or when someone's getting really frazzled, you give them more space. Closing those distances, is helpful, and you lose that in a deposition.
you also obviously having another attorney in there that's watching everything you say and who's been through, 500 or so depositions as well. So,
yeah. So that definitely changes the dynamic a little bit versus, you being alone in an actual interrogation room. So that's an interesting point that I hadn't thought about until you just mentioned it. But, one of the things is, so I guess the question becomes, as you transitioned, after having this experience in your previous law enforcement and intelligence, and then moved to being an attorney, what were kind of the initial, I guess, roadblocks that you had as you were moving from one career to the next? And then how is it that you overcame them?
It's not really with the attorney tasks. It's the business development side of it for sure was the biggest challenge for me and adaptation. I mean, when I worked in my prior life, I didn't have to go find my work, right? It found me. There was always an abundance to do, and I didn't have to go find it, right? I think one of the things you kind of learn in this world is even, taking out, your actual outside the firm clients, you've got to kind of build that reputation within your firm to get the kind of work you want to work on, so you don't kind of get stuck on the jobs you don't want to do, right? And so, and I think that's a new concept for me. It's not something I had to deal with beforehand. And so initially, you do it by just being the most prepared person in the room on any file, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many hours of non-billable time I've spent learning the technology or learning what the business did on my own, knowing that I've got a meeting the next day so that I can ask informed and relevant questions. And so I would do that, and that helped me kind of build internally, that base with the partners that I was working on. And so I was able to get busy with the work I wanted to do instead of getting busy with just what was left. And I think that's very important. If you want to control what you do, just do at least a few things well.
And speaking of that, how did you find kind of your niche that you do? Can you give the listeners kind of what your area that you actually are engaged with as an attorney, and then kind of how is it that you found that area, that niche, that you selected?
Yeah, so I would say I've kind of got two areas that I spend a lot of focus on. One is I do a lot of work with industrial clients, people in oil and gas, and developing technologies for oil and gas. And I think what I enjoy about that is I probably was supposed to be an engineer, and I missed my calling. And I like digging into how these technologies work, how how these vessels function, whatever the operation is that is kind of at the heart. And sometimes I'm in those for personal injury cases. Sometimes it's a contract dispute. There's a variety of reasons that I'll be involved in those cases. But at the crux of the ones that are really that I enjoy, where there's some function of equipment that it's crucial to understand that. And that's where, I think kind of digging in and my investigation background before, I want to learn how all that functions so I can see what went right and what went wrong. And then it's almost a competition in my brain between me and the experts to figure it out first. And then on the other side of it, was actually an area I just kind of got thrown into. And in my prior firm, we did a lot of insurance coverage work. And so I got very familiar with how to read insurance policies. And I've decided that there's definitely there's some fun in the puzzle of how to piece these insurance policies together to make sure that you've got, people into coverage. And that works well with a lot of my industrial clients who need to make sure that they have insurance coverage for whatever we're doing at the end of the day. So.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, and I've heard it from others as well, and I think it's very important, is the idea that you were saying to learn the technology or learn the space that you're in, right? If you're going to be doing trucking, you're going to want to learn all the aspects of trucking. I've even seen now actually where some plaintiff attorneys firms are actually sending their attorneys who do trucking to actual truck driving almost school so that they can learn all the ins and outs of the actual truck, so they know when they're referring to things in the case, they're clear on what they're referring to. So I think that's a good point to what you're saying, is finding that niche, finding that area that you like, and then essentially learning everything you can in that area so that you're really the go-to expert when it comes to that, because you're already up to speed. on the topics and that you can speak the lingo of the actual employees and potential witnesses and all the others that are involved with the case. So I think that's an excellent point.
Yeah, that's actually kind of there's a funny story on something like that for me. I didn't go to trucking school, but I had a case that was heavily involved with oxygen hazards, right? And I had spent a long time digging into how the technology worked and how these processes functioned, and meeting with these, PhDs and, chemical engineering and everything. And by close to the end of the case, as we were getting ready for expert depositions, I got invited to go attend the Oxygen Hazard Fire Risk Analysis School. And so I got to sit in this course with all these, designers from Boeing and the Navy and all these engineers, working out these complicated calculations on what metals to use and stuff like that. And so I learned all the calculations, and it was a lot of fun. I completely nerded out for a week with all these guys and people from NASA and everything. It was a lot of fun. And then I went back, and it was fun to be more qualified than the opposing expert.
Yeah. Very cool. One of the things I want to wrap up with, we briefly mentioned it, kind of your law enforcement and intelligence experience and that, I guess. Do you have any kind of suggestions, tips, tricks, any things that you have taken from your law enforcement and moved to deposition that you can let our listeners know that they could potentially use?
Yeah, I think probably when I'm working with younger attorneys, they want to script out a deposition. When they're taking a deposition, they'll write out these really long, detailed questions in a precise order. And when you're opposing someone that's taking those depositions, it's pretty easily recognizable that someone's working from a script. And the problem is they never go to plan, right? I mean, the witness always says something you're not expecting. And if you stick to your script, then you miss out on these really juicy bits of information that you can gather. And so I think the big advice I have for young attorneys is that instead of trying to script out a whole deposition, use key points, right? I mean, list your elements, list some sub elements in there. If there's some topics you want to talk about, but do it more bullet point style and topical, and then funnel your approach, right? Start broad, ask questions in a broad fashion, and then work your way down to the details you want. And then when you have exhausted that, move on to the next bullet point. So,
and I think that's a good point when you talk about scripts, because, when we train witnesses, we talk about it, and that essentially we let witnesses know that when opposing counsel is working from the script, right, their approach is going to be to throw them off the script. And when opposing counsel gets thrown off the script, then they're in a world of hurt, because now they actually have to start earning their paycheck and start having to come up with questions on the fly, which becomes really, really difficult, as I'm sure you know. So I think that's a very good point to bring up about not scripting things, because as you've said, when somebody finds out that it's scripted, and you get thrown off, then it goes bad. The deposition goes bad, and it becomes ineffective.
Right. And so it's always my hope that opposing counsel is following the script, but
Yeah. It's one of your first questions you ask, right, at the very beginning when you walk in. Hey, you got your script with you?
How many pages is this today?
Well, Justin, I appreciate you coming on. If anybody wants to get a hold of you, has an additional questions for you, wants to talk more with you about any potential cases or your experiences, how do they get a hold of you?
So probably the easiest way for me is by email, and that's at jratley, Ratley, at munsch.com, and that's munsch.com. And you can get me on my phone too. I think the line is 713-222-4087.
Great. I appreciate it, Justin. And if you need to find anything additional, any of these additional podcasts, blogs, we have several things of content, a lot of pieces up on courtroomsciences.com. I can be reached at swood@courtroomsciences.com. This has been another edition of the Litigation Psychology Podcast, brought to you by Courtroom Sciences, Inc. Thanks for joining.